Swinburne University of Technology.
This is David Lubinsky interviewing Nick Mackintosh at ISIR 2013, distinguished interviewee for this year. And Nick, let me just start by thanking you for coming and traveling a long way from England to spend a conference with us. We were delighted to have you here.
My pleasure, too.
Okay. Nick, the way we usually start here, if people are interested in aspects of your career and how you got started, could you tell us a little bit about your educational history?
My undergraduate degree was in psychology and philosophy at Oxford. If we want to go back further than that, at school I studied Latin, Greek, English literature and history, and essentially no science. And I gave up mathematics at the age of 15. Good training for a psychologist, I thought.
So you received a double major in philosophy and psychology?
Yeah, well, it's a joint major, yes.
Joint. And how did you determine graduate school instead?
You mentioned Clark Hull as having some parallels with me. And a slightly embarrassing parallel is that in his autobiography, Hull was musing whether he should have specialized in psychology or in physics. And he settled for psychology because it was easier to become famous in psychology. My view was that only about one philosopher a generation makes a serious contribution to philosophy, and I certainly wasn't going to be that one philosopher, whereas it was going to be quite easy to do something in psychology. So I chose psychology.
Who was your advisor?
A man called Stuart Sutherland, I doubt if many people here have met or heard of. I see Randall has. He was a rather flamboyant character. He drank a lot, he smoked a lot, he chased young women quite a lot too. So I haven't imitated him in all respects.
And how did he influence you?
Well, actually, he employed me as a research assistant as an undergraduate, and that got me to spend a summer in Naples with the prospect, if I carried on doing research with him, I'd spend most of my summers in Naples for the next 5 years. That seemed irresistible.
So you were systematic about it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. After all your training in experimental psychology and animal learning, how did you become interested in intelligence?
Well, there are two answers, I guess, to that. I mean, the first is it's all Leo Kamen's fault. As Linda Gottfredson reminded us, those of you who are too young to remember, the 1960s, 1970s were a time of fairly extreme environmental views about the sources of individual variation and intelligence, certainly in North America. I think less so in Britain, although some of the quotations you've seen from various newspapers in Britain would imply otherwise these days. But in psychology, I don't think, I certainly had no doubt that IQ was partly heritable. I, even to my shame, admit that the writings of Cyril Burt probably influenced me in that direction. So when a friend of mine in North America in 1972 or 3 said they'd been to a meeting of the Eastern Psychological Association, of which Leo Kamen had given a long talk in which he had concluded that there was no evidence whatsoever to suggest that IQ was in any sense heritable, and by the way, Cyril Burt was a fraud. I felt actually slightly ashamed that I'd taken the heritability view for granted without really questioning it very much. So I thought that I should take the trouble to go and read Kamin's book when it came out, and then take quite a lot more trouble to go back to the original literature that he was reporting. And I persuaded the editor of a journal in Britain to let me write a 10-page review of Kamin's book, which on the whole concluded, although there was a lot of great interest in it, we have to be polite, he was a friend of mine now, he grossly exaggerated his case. It was just nonsense to say that there was no evidence for the heritability of IQ. Rather surprisingly, in those days, there were very few people doing research on intelligence in Britain. That one review established me as someone that people could call upon as an expert in the field. And the next thing that happened is that I was invited to contribute a chapter to a government report on the educational failings of ethnic minority children in Britain, which I did, and that required a fair amount of research, along with a colleague in Cambridge. And later, when this Burt scandal broke in Britain, I was invited to review Leslie Hernshaw's biography of Burt, which concluded that yes, he was a fraud, and later still by the British Psychological Society when it started getting cold feet about whether Burt had been a fraud or not, since a couple of books had emerged which defended him. I was invited as a supposedly impartial, what a joke, reviewer of the Burt case at a special symposium the British Psychological Society were planning to organize. Actually, the symposium never happened, but again, I'd done enough work on this to feel that I wasn't going to waste my time, so I produced a book about Burt. So that's the first reason, that it just sort of snowballed a bit. And the other is that I teach, and started about that time teaching intelligence. When I went to Cambridge in 1980, the introductory course there had a slot of about 3 or 4 lectures on intelligence, given by a lecturer who had just retired, so I took over that. And I also needed to give a final year course of some sort. Normally that would have been on animal learning, but there was already a friend and colleague of mine at Cambridge, Tony Dickinson, who was giving a perfectly successful course of that nature. So I had to find something else to teach. So I taught intelligence.
Did you enjoy it?
Yes, very much indeed. Yes, partly it's actually more fun, I think, teaching something that is relatively new to you. To teach a course on animal learning theory, I could do it in my sleep, and probably did. To teach a course on intelligence required me to keep up, to read the background literature, so that I kept one step ahead of fairly clever Cambridge undergraduates. And this I've discussed in an article that Doug Detterman asked me to write for a special issue of his journal on why teach intelligence. And I think, apart from pure fun and interest, I think a course on intelligence is something that all psychology undergraduates should be exposed to, because the public perceptions about intelligence and IQ testing, as again those newspaper extracts will reveal, are really not very accurate, are they? And the one thing a psychology graduate should know enough is to dispute that public perception. But I don't think most of them can. If all they've had is half a dozen lectures in an introductory course, they just won't know enough to show that the public perception is mistaken. So one should correct them.
When you were getting into the area of intelligence and doing a lot of reading and thinking, how do you think your background in animal learning and experimental psychology influenced you compared to a lot of psychometricians and differential psychologists who don't have that background?
Yep. Well, one general thought is that experimental psychologists may do boring research, but it's nearly always very well designed research. That is to say, and that I think is particularly true of animal learning psychologists, they know how to design an experiment. They know what sort of control group you need, in order to derive reasonable conclusions. And I'll give you one example. It's rather lucky Robert Plomin isn't here now. The slide he showed from a paper by Hayworth and others, supposedly showing that the heritability of IQ increases as people grow older. That's based on classic twin studies. So how would you show that twin studies demonstrated an increase in the heritability of IQ simply as a function of age? And the answer to any experimental psychologist is you'd hold everything else constant apart from age. Now that Hayworth study is a summary of at least half a dozen different studies, twin studies, done in different countries, different generations, with totally different IQ tests. That's not the way to demonstrate that age is the critical variable. Indeed, one of the studies on one of the adult twin studies was done in Norway, and the authors, noting that their data suggested a rather higher heritability for IQ than many other studies, interpreted their results as due to the homogeneity of Norwegian society by comparison with British or American. And that's a very reasonable interpretation. So, experimental psychologists know how to design experiments. Some IQ testers don't. All right, that's general. Animal learning. Animal learning is about the effects of experience on behavior. And that has certainly been one influence. I mean, one concrete influence that my training in animal learning has had is that it has persuaded me that there is a distinction between Kahneman's fast and low thinking, explicit versus implicit learning and behavior. Associative learning as studied in animals is implicit fast. Cognition as studied by IQ testers is slow and clever and cognitively complex, although I hate that word. So there's one thought that simply came from my training in animal learning. The other is any animal psychologist has to know some biology and is very likely to believe that biological factors influence behavior. So we're not all Dust Bowl empiricists. And indeed, I was taught very early on in my career not to be one, since the first course I taught at Oxford was an introduction to comparative psychology, where I gave the even-numbered lectures, and Nico Tinbergen, a Nobel Prize winner, gave the odd-numbered lectures in which he denounced psychologists as Dust Bowl empiricists who didn't know anything about biology or animal behavior. So I had to, in order to defend psychology here, I had to make sure that I learnt more. So certainly at that time in Oxford, ethology was probably a more important discipline than animal psychology, or even psychology in general. So I was exposed to that sort of background. and I think it has probably influenced me ever since. If you want a concrete example of that, virtually all animals show some greater or lesser degree of sexual dimorphism. If you take that as a sort of given background, it becomes relatively unsurprising to suppose that humans too should show sexual dimorphism in some characteristics. One of the characteristics in which other animals show differences between males and females is in spatial cognition. So it shouldn't come as a great surprise, at least to think of the possibility that human males and females differ in spatial cognition, as of course I think they do. And I take a rather brasher attitude to the possibility of sex differences than I suspect many other psychologists do, and that I'm sure is as a result of my training in animal psychology.
Now, help me understand your interest in initial exposure, but writing a whole textbook seems to take it to another level. What motivated that back in 1998, and then you did it again recently?
Well, I retired from my job in Cambridge in 2002, I think, so I had to do something. Rewriting that book, with which by then I was mildly dissatisfied, was something to do. It will still sound flippant, my answer, but truthfully the reason why I wrote the book is that I'd spent by then 10-15 years teaching an advanced course on human intelligence, and I wasn't going to have all that material wasted in lecture notes and forgotten by students. So I was going to write a book about it. And the book is simply, obviously, a very greatly expanded version of the lectures I gave.
What is most memorable to you in terms of what you learned between the first and the second edition of your book?
Yeah, you warned me that you were going to ask this question, and my initial flippant answer was that there were a lot of mistakes in the '98 book, and there were. What has happened? What changed? I think the most interesting change, to me at least, and I don't expect you'll all agree with this, but I'm sure Randy Engel will, is that we now know something more about working memory, and we now have the beginning, I think only still beginning, to understand why it's important, why it's not unitary, why possibly training could have an impact on IQ and other things. But we do have some notion, we have alternative theories about the contribution of working memory to human intelligence. And that we haven't got very far, but I'm quite certain that is going to be a major contribution in future. Just as I also think we now understand more clearly that the intelligence studied by cognitive scientists and cognitive neuroscientists is actually what they call executive function. And executive function tasks are by and large defined as tasks which are disrupted by frontal lesions. And they have virtually nothing else in common with one another. And they don't have very much in common with the IQ that we lot use. Why not? They clearly are, in some sense, cognitively demanding tasks, but with the exception of executive function tasks that are involved in updating, the rest really don't correlate with IQ. What is it they're measuring that's different? Who's right? The cognitive scientists who say we have the right measure of intelligence, or the IQ testers who say we have the right measure? There's got to be, presumably, in the end, some compromise here, but I think it's not solved yet, but it's something that needs to be solved and will, I'm sure, eventually get solved, although that will require IQ test as learning more cognitive science. And cognitive scientists, this is a much greater challenge, getting interested in individual differences.
What do you think are the most important questions currently facing us in intelligence research?
Well, that was one of them, and I'm sure it is one of the most important. Two others that seem to me very important, but I suspect that you will not all agree with me when I say this. The first is to understand G. What is the explanation of G? And I don't think we know that. And I think, and here I will get unpopular, is that the reason we don't know the answer to that is that we aren't asking the right question. The right question here is, what is the explanation of the positive manifold? Why do all IQ tests correlate with one another? That's why G happens, is simply because factor analysis of a set of measures that are all correlated with one another will necessarily produce a general factor. But the reason for saying the way to ask the question is, what is the explanation of the positive manifold, is that concentrates your mind in why is it that all IQ tests correlate with one another. Now, of course, one possible answer is because they're all measuring one or several processes, operations, whatever you want to call them, that are common to all IQ tests. But there are other explanations, and I think we need to think seriously about them. That actually it's not, G is not general intelligence, it's actually general stupidity, because that's where the correlations are stronger. Well, here's another example that makes me admire Jim Flynn. He points out that within any one generation, the vocabulary and similarities tests of the Wetzler intelligence scale correlate very highly, and indeed are part of the verbal half of the test, or whatever it's now called, verbal comprehension, subgrouping of tests. But across generations, they don't correlate at all. Similarities scores on the similarities test have increased by 20 points in North America in the last 30, 40 years. Scores on vocabulary have stayed virtually constant. Therefore, they aren't the same thing, and they're not just measuring the same thing. So the fact that two tests, many tests within any IQ test battery correlate with one another does not prove that they're all measuring the same thing. If I could put that in bold letters, I would. We need to think more widely about why tests correlate. There are various reasons. My other belief is that what we need to study more, and again, I won't be popular for saying it, maybe, is what is it that IQ doesn't predict, or what other aspects of intelligence are important? When I talk to non-IQ testing colleagues, and actually to members of the general public, their real objection to IQ tests is they don't think they measure all aspects of intelligence. They just present silly little arbitrary problems. They just don't measure intelligence in the real world. Now, I think that's silly. That position is gross exaggeration. Of course, IQ tests measure at least some aspects of what any sensible person would accept as something to do with intelligence. But I think it's equally reasonable to argue that they don't measure all aspects, and I think it will be important to try to work out what other aspects of intelligence not measured by IQ tests contribute to our everyday behavior. I'm sure that Linda Gottfredson is going to disagree with me strongly here. But I suggest this as something that IQ testers should think more about than they do today. It's only absurd people like Gardner and not absurd, a very clever man, Bob Sternberg, who argues very strongly for the idea that there are other aspects of intelligence that IQ tests don't measure but are important. And I would like to believe that IQ testers would be prepared to think harder about that possibility and do something.
Do you have a feel for how much of the variance in performance we currently have a hold of with our existing measures? Because obviously performance has to do with energy and interest and conscientiousness and all those things, and complex behavior is multiply determined. You think there's a big chunk of variance there in intellectual functioning or cognition that we don't get yet?
We don't get with our tests.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if test scores only predict educational attainment at 0.5, then yeah, of course there are a lot of other things that predict educational performance. Some of them pure chance, I've no doubt, and random error. Some of them measurable and interesting and important. Conscientiousness will no doubt be one of them. Ability to defer gratification in Duckworth and Seligman's data as being a much more important variable than differences in IQ that predict why girls do better than boys at school. That's something we need to understand. I'm going to go on a bugbear in a minute, but a lot of the discussion about possible sex differences in any sort of intelligence or accomplishment seems to me, as a man, to be phrased in the context of it's all unfair on women. But one of the several no, I won't say indisputable, because in this area everything is disputed by somebody. One of what I would regard as one of the better established differences between males and females is that girls and women do better in education than boys and men. That's certainly true in the United States, it's certainly true in Britain. Why? And isn't that just as important, if not more so, than the fact, well actually it's a lot more important than the fact that men do better than women at tests of mental rotation. But I think there's more agitation about that second difference than there is about the first, and that seems odd to me. We really do need to understand why it is that males are doing so much worse in the educational system than women do.
Nick, what do you feel is your greatest contribution to psychological science?
Oh, well, that's certainly not going to be in intelligence research, I'm afraid. I mean, I've dabbled in doing research in intelligence, but I really wouldn't claim to have made any major contributions there. No, my major contributions have to be within animal learning. And I'm not going to tell you what they are because you wouldn't be interested, but no, that's where I've made my major contributions, I'm quite certain. Something that perhaps borders onto study of human intelligence is my colleague Ian McLaren and I have spent the last 10-15 years working fairly intermittently, in my case rather more assiduously in his, on this notion that there are two distinct learning systems that people have, a cognitive one and an associative one. It's very hard to persuade many human cognitive psychologists that mere associative learning could produce anything in people, but that just seems to me a ridiculous position to hold. And I think we have gone some way to showing that both systems work in people. It's not a novel idea. As I said, it's underlies Danny Kahneman's distinction between slow and fast learning. But I think it's a very important one. And by and large, of course, I believe that most animal learning is done associatively. So that associative learning is probably more important in other animals than it is in people. And you have to do your experiment in fairly complicated ways in order to reveal associative learning occurring in people. You can't give them time to stop and think, basically. You've got to hurry them up. You often have to measure things by reaction time rather than problem solving correct versus incorrect solutions. But when you do the experiment in the right way, even Cambridge undergraduates can be persuaded to behave like pigeons without flying. Yes, sorry.
Nick, when you look back at your professional career, what would you say you're proudest of?
Oh, the books I've written. Rather more in animal learning than in human intelligence. But, well, perhaps here my school education enters into it. I didn't get taught science at school. I got taught English literature, classics, and that taught me how to write. The proudest report I ever received from my not wholly successful school days was, Mackintosh has a fertile mind and a fluent pen and uses both to avoid doing any work.
That is interesting. That is interesting.
So, no, I do genuinely, I think I have insofar as I have talents, they're revealed in writing books.
Okay. What would you say are your most salient professional regrets?
I think probably that I got distracted by other things and didn't do enough work on animal learning. I mean, I'm probably best known in the field of animal learning for a theory I produced, oh God, 35 years ago. That's a bit sad, isn't it? Which does still get cited. It is clearly wrong, and with my colleague John Pierce, we've rewritten it in various ways to mend some of the mistakes. But I didn't spend enough time in the 1980s and 90s working on that theory to test it better and to revise it better. Some of that was because my job at Cambridge was being head of department for 22 years, which does distract one from other things a bit. Part of it, I suppose, is that I got distracted in writing about IQ. But that's my regret, my major regret, is that I didn't do the work I could and should have done back in the 1980s.
Sometimes when I hear administrators say that, especially, I mean, you were chair for over 20 years of one of the best psychology departments in the world, and you had to be successful. Do you have a feel? You had to make contributions by the people you hired, who promoted. Did you have more impact that way, possibly, than if you would have tweaked your theories?
Yeah, possibly. No one becomes famous by being a good head of department. Your colleagues may respect you and admire you. One or two other people may say, oh golly, Cambridge is so much better now than it was 20 years ago. So that Mackintosh must have had something to do with that. I was proud of what I did at Cambridge. I was proud that on the whole, I think I was a reasonably good head of department. Certainly whenever it came round to voting on whether I should continue or whether one of my colleagues should step in, they voted for me. Not for, I'm the only two people who volunteered, but two people that no one else in the department could stand, so it was a fairly easy election to win. But I am proud of what I achieved there. I think we did become a very good department. A rather silly bit of pride is the government has, in the last 30 years, the British government has sort of introduced various measures of universities' achievements. They have a research assessment exercise, but they also had a teaching quality assessment exercise, which when other departments in Cambridge were informed that the government was going to come along and measure how well they taught, there was almost universal outrage. How dare the government interfere? We know how to teach, they don't. So actually most Cambridge departments that were evaluated by this exercise obtained fairly low scores. And the psychology department was the first department in Cambridge to get a perfect score. So yeah, I was proud of that.
Interesting. Who were your heroes in your professional life?
Well, the first has to be Stuart Sutherland, who was a charismatic man, a difficult man, but good fun. And he treated me as an equal, even when I was an undergraduate. We'd go out and have a beer together and discuss something. Mm-hmm. In the field of intelligence, actually Jim Flynn would have to be someone I very, very greatly admire. Mm-hmm. Partly because, like me, he came to it from a totally different background.
Right.
But I think the documentation of the Flynn effect, he wasn't the first to discover it, of course, but he was the first to document it so that nobody sensible person could deny it. And although I think for about 10 years he sort of rather floundered around trying to understand it, I think now in his more recent writings, he's actually got some way to understanding it, and more important, to understanding some of its implications and some of its non-implications. So yeah, I do admire him very much. Mm-hmm. It would have been invidious to mention anyone in this room, wouldn't it?
Nick, graduate students and postdocs love to hear from people like you. Any advice you might have for them starting out in the field of intelligence? We have a lot of young people here who are passionate about individual differences and reasoning and thinking. What advice would you give them in embarking on their academic careers?
Well, to learn some experimental psychology, in particular to learn some cognitive psychology and cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience. Mm-hmm. When I say neuroscience, it's not because I'm a great believer that neuroscientific research is going to solve all of psychology's problems. I don't think anything of the sort. But cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience really have had some things to say about human cognition, well, quite a lot to say about human cognition in the last 20 years. And that is something that anyone who says, I'm interested in intelligence, really ought to know about. I know, of course, cognitive scientists regard individual differences as just a nuisance or noise or whatever. But that doesn't mean that everything they've said about cognition is of no interest to intelligence testers. It really ought to be. And although I think, on the whole, I do think that cognitive psychologists are more to blame than IQ testers are for the fact that there's virtually no crosstalk between the two disciplines. If I'm going to advise people here, then yeah, you're the ones who are going to have to learn some cognitive psychology and educate and talk to your colleagues in that science, in that discipline.
Well, Nick, at this point in the interview, usually we turn it over to the audience because I know they're going to have a lot of questions for you and are eager to ask you. But before we do that, do you have anything to add after going over all this material that you'd like people to know about you?
Oh, no, certainly not. I think I probably ad-libbed enough with irrelevances and odd thoughts that have come to my mind. No, I'll stop there for the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. This has been enjoyable.
This has been a Swinburne